So growing up, my least favorite school day was the first day of school. Now, I was the kid that absolutely loved school, a little bit of a nerd, so I enjoy spending time learning, studying, and growing. People actually cheated off my paper. I was the athlete that actually got cheated off of. But the reason I hated the first day of school, because teachers, and I know there's several teachers in the room, the teachers had to say the first name, the middle name, and last name of every student. And so by the time I was in third grade, I'll tell you why in a minute, this became my least favorite day of the year. Man, I would go to every length I possibly could to avoid my middle name being shared with the entire class. And I don't know if any of you guys have embarrassing first or middle names, but man, that was me. So I was that kid that every class period, every time we changed, I would try to remember who was ahead of me on the roll sheet. I don't know if you've ever been there. A couple of you have. Some teachers, you probably have had this happen before to you. I'm a substitute teacher here in the county, so I call kids by their last name so that I avoid this situation because it's happened to me all the time. So I would actually memorize where the kids were in front of me, and then when the teacher would call that kid's name, that guy or that girl, and they said here, I would jump up out of my seat. No, I'm here. I'm here. Don't even mess with the next one. That's me. Don't even say my middle name. Last name's cool. First name's good. Don't mix it up. Never call me by my middle name. But of course, that didn't work because it created enough of the distraction that the teacher felt like they missed my name. So they had to continue with the roll. And they eventually would say my first name, which is obviously Jason. And then they would say my middle name, and then everybody would laugh at me. And this happened from third grade all the way to the end of eighth grade. And you're probably wondering, man, what in the world is your middle name? Well, my middle name is Homer. And now, my middle name, it's important to me because I was named after my grandfather. My grandfather, as we get to know each other, you'll learn that my grandfather is my hero. He took me in when he didn't have to, and so he was my hero, and I was totally cool with my middle name being Homer. In fact, my oldest son, his middle name is Homer. He has to deal with it. But what made things bad was that this guy on the screen was super popular when I was growing up in elementary school and middle school. So I got all of the punchlines dealing with this guy. But whatever your situation, you probably have a story when it comes to your name. In fact, I know you have a story when it comes to your name because I have sat with my wife, Erin, and we have agonized over the names that we would give our children because names, they carry meaning. They carry legacy. They can bring pressure, right? Some of you may have been named after somebody famous or somebody, in your family, and it carries pressure to a degree. And names serve a huge purpose in our life. And your name, after all, represents all that you are and all that you're known for, both good and bad. So when your name is said in public, there's some people that will, oh, yeah, that guy's awesome, or, I got to stay away from that guy. So for me, my middle name mattered. It was my grandfather's name, and you might be named after a close friend or a family member or something, and your name matters to you big time. And so when I was made fun of, I dug my heels in and I fought for that name because that was my grandfather's name. It was who I was. I didn't have a relationship with my dad. It was my relationship. So it was my name. And that's why I got so frustrated. And in our culture, you guys realize this, we're obsessed with what we are called, how we label, and how we attach meaning to groups of people and to individuals. It happens all the time. We're obsessed with it. And sometimes we care so much about what we're called because of what we derive from that. We derive purpose and meaning and hope from our name. And names were a big deal in the ancient culture that we've been studying the last couple of weeks. Names are huge. okay? So Jacob, this is true for him as well, and we're going to see this morning, Jacob gets a name change, which is incredible. To recap where we've been, Jacob's name means deceiver. And if you've paid attention, if you've been here the last couple of weeks, Clint's unpacked several really awesome truths for us that wrap around Jacob's name, meaning deception or deceiver. Two major thoughts from these last 2 weeks have stuck with me. The first one is this that Clint said 2 weeks ago. He said, God will never ask you to lie to accomplish his will. In Jacob's story, God kept promising that he'd be with him, but Jacob kept scheming anyway. Jacob was promised by God, a huge promise that we'll come back to in a second, from his grandfather, passed down to his father, and now to him, and he's still living in the deception of his name that's tied to that. The second thing Clint said last week that really struck me, I've been thinking about this all week, he said the truth belongs to Jesus, and the truth belongs in you. So this is the tension here. This is the tension in our story that Jacob has a name and it means deceiver, but then there's this truth and there's this promise from God that Jacob is in between. He's back and forth. If you read his story, he's back and forth in the middle of this tension quite often. And today we're going to see that he's in between his name and what his name has come to mean and the promise that God has for him. Deception has become the leading characteristic in Jacob's life to this point. And whether he's being led astray by his mom to deceive his dad and his brother, or whether it was completely of his own doing, Jacob's web of lies was what he was known for. You know, God is and has been providing for Jacob up to this point. God is showing up for Jacob consistently. God is reminding Jacob of the promise that he gave to his grandfather, Abraham. Jacob, at this point in our story, is just not hearing it. I don't know if you've ever been there, but he's just not hearing it. He's not wanting to hear it. He's not wanting to hear the promise. Jacob keeps taking his life into his own hands. How many of us do that? We keep taking our life into our own hands. He's not willing to wait on God. His patience is gone, okay? Jacob knows the promise, but he's not living in that promise. He knows it, but he's not living in it, so he's stuck between his name and a promise. But before you start slamming Jacob in your head, I want you to remember this, is that we struggle to trust God. We actually run from God sometimes. Some of you may be running from God right now. We conceal things from our community. We talked about that last week. We sit in small groups like Brad and Gail just talked about. We sit in those small groups and we hide things from people because we don't want the truth to be known. We want to cover things up. We're a lot like Jacob. We struggle to follow God's clear leading. We struggle to follow the promise. We live our lives from Monday to Saturday on our own, in our own will, with our own name. And then on Sunday, we come into a place like this and we take on God's name, sing a few songs, and remember the promise. And then Sunday afternoon, we're back out at it. We're all like Jacob. I'm like Jacob. I do it all the time. I noticed myself this week doing things as we've seen at the beginning of Jacob's story. You know, guys, we learn this at a young age. We deceive, we manipulate, and we learn how to play the situation to get the results that we want. If you have a young kid, you know that happens. That happened in my house yesterday with my daughter cleaning her room. It was there. It was in there. It was frustrating, very frustrating. But our behaviors sometimes end up earning us our labels and our nicknames. So we might have something that our name actually means, but then our behavior turns us and the persona of ourselves into something completely different than we want to be. And that's where we have Jacob today. So to recap a little bit of the story and then add some to it, Jacob, in this section of the story, is ready to take his 4 wives and all the kids and the livestock back home. If you weren't here last week, Clint talked about how Jacob had Rachel and Leah and then their maidservants and 4 wives, and at this point, 11 sons and at least 1 daughter that's mentioned, and they take them back home. Jacob and Laban is his uncle and also his father-in-law. Just go back and listen to the talk from last week. They have a significant discussion. After Rachel has Joseph, who's the 11th kid, like I said, Jacob tells Laban that he's ready to go home. Laban tries to tell Jacob not to go home. Laban does not want Jacob to go home because Laban has acquired wealth since Jacob has been working for him. He does not want to see him leave. He doesn't want to see him take his daughters and his grandchildren away, but Jacob has to go home. He has to go home. They have this argument back and forth, and Jacob, the negotiator, negotiates a deal. And even in this deal, he negotiates his wages, which in that day, in this situation, was livestock. And even inside of this deal, Jacob is deceiving and manipulating Laban to get what he wants. Laban eventually catches up with Jacob and Rachel and Leah after they try to sneak away. But tucked in the middle of this story, we see this verse. It says this: Then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and of your relatives, and I will be with you. You see, guys, in the midst of all this chaos, in the midst of all the deception, in the midst of all of this, God offers yet another promise in the middle of Jacob's deception. Did you catch that? Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. He's going back to the promise of before that was to Abraham, that your family would outnumber the stars in the sky and the sands on the shore. And he's ratcheting it up a notch. He's saying, hey, go home. It's okay. I'll protect you. I'll protect you. It's going to be okay. After Laban and Jacob reach a deal, Laban sets out to go home. Jacob moves on as well. And Jacob, they smooth things out and they're headed back home. And Jacob's taking all the livestock and his wives and his 11 kids and however many, I don't know. He's taking a bunch of stuff back home. And when he starts out on his way home, God, in chapter 32, sends him something quite incredible. He sends Jacob a host of angels to remind him, in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 32, that God is with him. And scholars believe that this is actually a war host of angels. And Jacob takes time, he sees this war host that's with him, ready to go back and do battle as they go back to Esau. And he just kind of wants to do things on his own again. Verses 3 we just start seeing how Jacob just goes back to his own plan. God gave him a war host, right, of angels. I don't imagine these to be like the cute little angels that we see in commercials or whatever, in movies or whatever. These are bad mamma jammas, and they're ready to go to war, right? And then Jacob starts off on his own plan, which is crazy to me. It's crazy. Jacob sends messengers ahead to Esau to let him know that they're planning to come back home. And then the messengers come back, catch this, they say, hey, so we went to hang out with Esau, and he's coming to meet you, and he's got 400 men. 400 men. Jacob, remember, has angels, a war host, an army of angels, and he starts flipping out because of 400 men. And we don't even know if Esau had 400 men. As many times as Jacob lied to Esau, Esau's probably like, man, I really got 12 guys, but I'm just going to tell the messengers we got 400, and that's what we got, right? But Jacob's scared again. How do I know that? Well, in Genesis 32, 7 and 8, it says this: in great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into 2 groups and flocks and herds and camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may be able to escape. Guys, the reason Jacob is in this position, he's in great fear and distress, is because he's not trusting God. God has angels, huge angels, we already talked about that, with him. And Jacob's scared of men. He's not only scared of men, he's scared of Esau. Because Jacob knows what his brother is capable of. Remember, there's nobody on this earth that knew Jacob or knew Esau quite like Jacob. Nobody. Jacob knew how his brother operated. He knew what all this meant. Jacob's reaction was to protect himself and at least half of what he had earned. His intention was not to follow God's plans. Jacob's reaction was to protect himself. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation where God's told you to do something and your reaction is to protect yourself. That's pretty natural. I've been there. But in desperation, we follow our plans. In faith, we follow God's plans. The next few verses that we have is the only recorded prayer of Jacob. Jacob prays. He says, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac." Remember, he's going back to the promise. He's trying to pump himself up when he's talking to God that, man, I can trust you because you gave me this promise. He's going back to it. He says, you told me to go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. Verse 10, he says, I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid that he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. Back to the promise of his grandfather, Abraham. He acknowledged God. He reiterated the promise of chapter 31, knew that God would be with him, but he just wasn't acting like it. This prayer is interesting to me because it's perhaps a small glimpse into who Jacob was becoming. It's potentially a small glimpse into a small baby step that Jacob is taking towards growth. And at Foundation, if you've been around for a while or if you haven't, we talk quite a bit about growth. And this very well could have been Jacob's first baby step towards growth. He's submitting. He's like, hey, I don't know everything, but I need some help. And Jacob's got 400 men, or Esau's got 400 men. I'm scared of them. I remember this promise from my grandfather, so I'm going to pray, and hopefully that we're going to activate that promise that you'll take care of me. Prayers of desperation can be a catalyst to intimacy with God. Prayers of desperation can be a catalyst to intimacy with God, and I think that's what we have here with Jacob. This is huge. So then what happens after the story, to paraphrase, Jacob sends servants, family, livestock ahead of him to meet Esau, and he's eventually left by himself at the camp that they set up that night. And Jacob is at his wit's end. He's at this crossroads, right? He's by himself. He's already prayed. He doesn't show or exhibit any time before that he actually knows how to do that really, right? So he's been in this desperate moment. And he's sitting there. I envision him sitting there, and he's just, what's next? What's next? Jacob's at his wit's end. Verse 24 and 25 of 32 say this. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Yeah, that's true. I didn't write that and put it on the screen. Like that actually happened. This man steps in and saw that he could not overpower Jacob. So he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. God sees that Jacob is at his wit's end and actually steps into a ring with him. He steps into a match with Jacob. Now, people have argued over time, who in the world is this man? Some people believe that it was an angel. Some scholars believe that it was one of those Old Testament pre-incarnation moments where Jesus actually steps into the scene and fights in some way for the people of God. Jacob, in just a minute, will uncover who he believes this to be. At the very least, right now, we know that this guy is a complete representation or a representative of God sent for a very distinct purpose. He is there to wrestle with Jacob. He is there to continue the fight with Jacob and take it from a mental and emotional wrestling match that he's been on for quite some time to a physical, no holds barred. We are going to come up with something at the end of this moment. We all have a fight or flight impulse. We have a natural way that we would respond in this scenario, and Jacob's impulse from birth was to fight. He was going to fight, and he was going to scrap, and he was going to claw. He was a fighter, and God knew that. He knew that this would strike a chord with Jacob. Guys, when God initiates the fight, it often results in people having a choice between faith and fear. Now, I don't know what I would do in that situation, but recently I was presented with a similar situation. As Clint talked about earlier, I was in campus ministry for 12 years, and God wanted me to be a part of this and wanted my family to be a part of this. And I fought and fought and fought and fought, and eventually God stepped in. And through a series of only things that God could do, I'm standing here now. But he fought, and he fought, and he fought with me. So I know that this is possible, right? I know it's not just something, I'm not maybe actually physically tussled with God before, but God has fought with me, and I know he's probably fought with you. Verse 26, Then the man said this, he said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." How bold is that? Hey, I know there's something special about you. You tapped my hip, and now I can't walk, but I'm not letting you go until you bless me. I am not letting you go. I'm not letting you go until you bless me. This is probably the closest that Jacob has ever been to God. Jacob wanted to be as close to God for as long as he could be because he hadn't been there before. This was not a brash moment for Jacob, I don't think. I think this was I was desperate and I called out to you and you showed up, so I want to stay with you. I want to stay where you are. The man then asked him in verse 27, he said, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. And the point of this question is to get Jacob, God, I think the guy knew it was Jacob. Like, I don't think that just God threw this guy down and was like, "Hey, there's going to be this dude over here, and I think his name is Jacob." I'm not even sure, but so this is not like an introduction. This is Scripture giving us a moment where Jacob could sit and say, "I'm Jacob. I'm a deceiver. I'm a failure. I quit on the promise. 2 generations in, man, I'm going to blow it." That's the moment that Jacob is having right here. What he's having. To realize that what God wants to do, he sees what's going on here, and this is a huge point of vulnerability for Jacob. In this point of vulnerability, God shows grace. Every time Jacob said his name, he was reminded of what it meant, but God was there to change Jacob. God was there to change him. To realize that God wanted to make him new. He wanted to make Jacob new. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says this. It says, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old is gone, the new is here." That's what's happening right now for Jacob. When the man asked Jacob what his name is, he's getting him to call out the old so that the new can come. So that the new can be a part of who he is. Verse 28, Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and humans, but have overcome." Struggled, but overcome. In other words, you've stood toe to toe with God and with men, and you fought. In other words, Jacob, you're a fighter. The positive is that Jacob persevered. We begin to see some positive character traits in who Jacob is. He's not just a deceiver anymore. He's persevering. He's persevering. Your name is no longer Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and humans and will overcome. And God's kids moving forward would now carry that name, Israel. It would be a name change. It was those who struggle with God and man and overcome, and we are a part of that. We are a part of that promise. You know, many people struggle with this. Many people struggle with fighting with God. Many people struggle. It's the first time I've ever got to do this, and it's the last time. Many people struggle, right, with God. Many people fight with God. Many people struggle with the fact that God stepped into the ring with Jacob. God stepped into Jacob's struggle not to embarrass him or to correct him, but to love him. He didn't come bringing judgment. He came bringing love and a new name and a new direction. I know a few people that I would call a champion of faith. You know? There's people that you look up to, but I can tell you, when you sit down with them, they have a moment where they have failed. They have a moment where they weren't the champ. And a lot of times the people that wear, this is a fake belt, obviously. The people that end up wearing this belt, right? They lose a few times before they get to be the champ. They lose a few more times than they win. But God steps in the ring here with Jacob. And Jacob did not leave the same. You cannot wrestle with God and leave unchanged. You know, I really believe, guys, that Jacob's hip was that way the rest of his life. I can't find anything in Scripture that says that his hip was fixed. He always walked with a limp to remember that God showed up in that wrestling match that day. God didn't show up to punish Jacob. He showed up to change Jacob. God didn't show up so that, Jacob would quit. In fact, he showed up so that Jacob would continue. He showed up so that Jacob would win his fight for faith. He showed up so that Jacob would win the promise that was given to Abraham just a couple of generations before. Now, if you don't hear anything else that I've said this morning, I want you to hear this. God doesn't fight to hurt you. He fights to change you. So whatever battle you're in right now, God fights to change you. For many of you, God desires right now to step in the ring and go toe-to-toe. And like Jacob, some of us are trying to hide from God. Some of us know what the battle is, but we stay far away from the ring. For some of you, you're in a fight for faith. You don't know if you believe in any of this. I want you to step in the ring with God. For some of you, you're in a fight to make a relationship right. Step in the ring. Some of you are in a fight over an addiction. Step in the ring with God. God doesn't want to hurt you. He wants to change you. Jesus is pretty clear. He says this in Luke. He says, whoever will lose his life will find it. Whoever steps into the ring and allows God to work will ultimately find life. It's a process. Jesus today desires to save us all from ourselves. He desires to save us from our plans, from our thoughts, and get us back on track to the promise that we so desperately need. Remember, God doesn't fight to hurt you. He fights to change you. And Jesus stepped down from heaven to fight for just that.